think what's critical to remember is that human rights have not been in the picture in terms of the planning of previous or current Irish governments. That what we've seen is that in determining how government delivers public services, how it plans public services, human rights have not necessarily been in that mix. Now, there are exceptions. The National Mental Health Strategy references a number of human rights obligations, but that sense of government's obligation to deliver upon public services in line with its human rights obligations hasn't been there. Now, that is both reflected in what happened pre-crisis, but also what's happening in terms of the recovery. There's no framing that human rights have a role to play in part of that recovery. We've had an interesting discussion recently about the obligation to repay debt, but not necessarily the obligation to deliver on human rights obligations. And it really then does come down to what government's intentions are in terms of that recovery and about economic recovery rather than about national recovery in a way that puts human rights at the centre. I think when we look at actually the challenges that government faces in terms of how it spends its money, how it delivers on particular areas of service provision, then we're not necessarily talking about spending more money. I mean, there have been studies done in Ireland, including around health, that say we can do more with the money that we have. We can more effectively, more efficiently spend our money. So it's not necessarily about increasing the pot, but it's about greater delivery of services within that pot of money. Even if we look at the question of some of the cuts and the very question of non-retrogression in human rights standards, there hasn't been any sense of, in determining which areas of service delivery to cut, while doing some of analysis of what are the cuts that would least impact on human rights. Some of that planning based on human rights principles would go some way towards delivering human rights obligations, but in a way that not necessarily involves spending more money. We're in an interesting place. Ireland just completed the last moment of the Human Rights Council around universal periodic review last week. One of the recommendations that it accepted was around protecting vulnerable groups during the economic crisis. Now, that absolutely has to be put into practice in terms of taking on board the human rights commitments that it owes to those vulnerable groups in terms of how it rolls out its recovery plans in the next year or the next number of years. In some ways, the universal periodic review commitments can be the action plan for human rights for the rest of the term of this government, and the two coincide. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that we're due to review our constitution. Never has there been a greater opportunity to put economic, social and cultural rights into the constitution at a time when we're talking about amending our constitution for other reasons. This is the time to actually protect those rights in law as a guard against future rollbacks on those rights.